Joining me today, we have the original gang back together. We've got Paul Sakkal, hot off the plane from China, where he was with the PM last week. He is our very own chief political correspondent. Hello, Paul.
Hey, it was hot off the plane. China was very hot.
Really?
When we arrived in Chengdu, which is this massive city in the western province of Sichuan, it was like mid-afternoon. I think it was 37 or 38 degrees in the air, and the real feel was 48.
Oh my gosh. I can't even imagine what that feels like.
It was the hottest afternoon I've ever felt when we went to a tennis court in the blaring sun where Chinese officials gave very long speeches, which needed to be translated at the same time. So to say we were sweating through our T-shirts and struggling would be an understatement. But it was a great trip.
It was grueling. Well, we really enjoyed your reporting. Just quickly, behind the scenes, how was Anthony Albanese's sort of demeanour when he was on the trip? Because when he first became Prime Minister, there was criticism that he didn't have he had sort of no international experience. How is he now on these big diplomatic trips? Is he more relaxed?
Well, I don't think when he came to the Prime Ministership, he was immediately seen as someone who would be comfortable on the international stage. He's never had a portfolio in the economic, security or foreign affairs spaces. He's an infrastructure guy before becoming leader. So I don't think people thought it would come naturally to him. But I think to his credit, and he would argue, the government does argue, that he's had an unexpected number of wins on the international stage. There's been this period of stabilisation with China, which is now potentially moving into a phase of even greater warmth. There's been close-knit ties with Indonesia, which the government is really proud of, a key regional ally. He's extracted a number of Australians from detention, including Chang Lei from China last year.
He got some people out of the clink in Indonesia too, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. So there are some things to hang your hat on there. And on the China trip, he was, particularly after the meetings with Chinese officials, including the President and Premier on the Tuesday, which was, I think, the third day of the trip, he was in quite a relaxed and really vibrant mood. I think he thought that the week exceeded expectations. He didn't expect to get a private lunch with the President after the formal bilateral meetings, which is only reserved for leaders with whom China is in a particularly strong diplomatic position with. He was bouncing around. And on the plane back, when I interviewed him, he was wearing a Joy Division T-shirt. He was very relaxed, and he was speaking quite effusively about the trip, and not really playing into the criticism from Conservatives back home that he might be cuddling up a little too closely with an autocrat. Yeah,
band T-shirt Albo is relaxed Albo. Let's move on to this week. Of course, there is one, a particular international diplomatic trip on which he has not gone, and a particular ally which has not invited him to visit, and we all know who that is. But there was some movement this week on that front. On Thursday, the news broke that the Australian government has lifted a ban on beef imports from the United States. This is something that the Trump administration has been lobbying for and cross about for quite some time, that we have had a ban on US beef imports. Why did we lift this ban now? Is the timing suspicious?
The Trade Minister, Don Farrell, on Thursday morning insisted there was nothing suspicious about it. This is just a scientific review that's been going on for 5 years, and the 5-year culmination just happened to come in the key period of months when Australia is negotiating with the US. And
this scientific review is basically about the fact that Australia has always felt that the United States doesn't have the right biosecurity sort of structures in place to stop us getting nasty diseases from cows from the US, specifically mad cow disease. That's my very, very brief and
that's
simplistic understanding of Australian biosecurity laws.
There was this long-standing US restriction based on an outbreak of mad cow disease many years ago. There hasn't actually been a formal ban for about 5 or 6 years, but no US beef has been imported into Australia because of these barriers around whether we can, in Australia, abide by our own really strict traceability rules for beef that actually is born in cattle that's born in Canada or Mexico but slaughtered in the US. Our officials have been over there for many, many months now trying to test if the US has put restrictions around their biosecurity that are sufficient for our own purposes. And in recent months, it's become clear that there was a positive trajectory in that review. And when we wrote a story a month ago on this topic, it was very much framed to us as a carrot for the US administration. Donald Trump has talked about how Australia blocks US beef. It's something that annoys him, and it was pitched to us as something that could be used in the tariff negotiations. Reported today by the Australian Financial Review that decision was finalised.
Yep.
But the government line, whenever a minister stands up to talk on the issue, they are not going near linking the tariff talk with the biosecurity change.
Okay, but let's talk about the realpolitik, because the Prime Minister has talked a pretty big game in the past, particularly during the election campaign, about acting always in Australia's interest when it comes to pressure from the Trump administration. Have they bowed to pressure here in a way, or thought, look, we can give them this in the hope that it will stand us in good stead for broader tariff negotiations with the US?
We've already seen the coalition come out, and the Nationals leader, David Littleproud, who's obviously someone with interest in on the cattle side of things and taking the side of farmers, they've come out and called this an act of appeasement of Donald Trump, and that the Prime Minister's trying to play catch-up in the relationship with the US. He hasn't met Donald Trump, and now he's reached for an easy win that compromises Australian agriculture. I think the government would say that criticism is over the top, that this was low-hanging fruit, where the government had an option to give the US something that it wanted, something that plays into Trump's personal kind of set of grievances. He's a guy who's spent part of his campaign flipping burgers at McDonald's. He loves McDonald's burgers. Australian beef is used in US burgers, so he would wonder why they can't sell beef into Australia.
Yeah.
This is something that might play into the way the president thinks about the world to cut a deal. And the Australians are pretty confident that it's not something that's going to hurt our biosecurity rules. So I think they would argue this is low-hanging fruit that gives us a little win, or a little chance of a win.
It's burger diplomacy.
Burger diplomacy.
We found the soft spot in Trump's otherwise very hard exterior.
Pandas to cattle.
These little Mexican cows that we're going to be eating. Okay, let's talk about the pomp and ceremony of Parliament opening this week. It was the 48th Parliament opened, and that's always a few special days in Canberra. The Governor-General addresses both houses. The lower house MPs go to the Senate, and they all crowd in together on the benches. The usher of the Black Rod comes into the lower house and grabs them all. They do that thing where they pretend to drag the Speaker to the chair. There are all these beautiful ancient traditions from our British democratic sort of parliamentary history. But I suppose the big story of the week for this 48th Parliament is the enormous disparity between the numbers on the government bench and the numbers on the opposition bench. So I just wanted to ask you about how that played out atmospherically, and also how Susan Lee went as the opposition leader in her first sort of formal week in that role in the Parliament.
Yeah, everyone had been flagging in the lead up to this first week that the optics of the huge government benches and the diminished oppositions would be quite striking. And, it's almost a cliche to say it now, but it really was. The feeling in the building this week is really palpable around the opposition just not having the same heft as last term. It lacks a figurehead leader in Peter Dutton, who is clearly hugely discredited now because of the election result. But for much of last term, at least the press gallery political bubble narrative was that he was ascendant. Parliament felt like a place where the opposition would often have the government on the back foot. They were nowhere near as small as they are now. And the Prime Minister had some really tough weeks. Instead, this week we have what feels really like a procession for the government's massive win in May. There's 3 bills on the agenda, all of which are relatively non-controversial and popular for Labor, being around boosting childcare safety, penalty rates, and the HECS fee, 20% fee cut. And the government made a call to not even talk about the contentious element of its agenda around superannuation tax. They're deferring that for another sitting fortnight, because what they want to do in this fortnight is get through these bits of legislation which were key popular promises, as well as do all of the maiden speeches for the new members, which were led off by Sarah Whitty, who beat Adam Bant, and Ailey France, who beat Peter Dutton. They all got Dorothy Dix's in question time. The Prime Minister's been pumping them up in his answers. Yeah. So it really does feel like a moment where the government is basking in its win. Yeah. And the opposition, and talking to some of the opposition members this week in private, this sounds terrible to say, but they're in this building, and I think some of them are questioning their place in politics. They're wondering, where they go next. they're wondering if they're in the same situation 3 years from now after the next election, whether they've made the right choice in their career. There are some really existential questions being asked in the coalition at the moment.
None of which I think is good for democracy. I mean, I know that's a sort of quite an earnest thing to say, but democracy does thrive, and the parliament does thrive when you have a really strong opposition. Let's move on to the opposition, because they had quite the week. As you say, the government was very much in the ascendancy. The government's looking good. Albanese's very cock of the hoop. But whatever sort of tentative peace we had at the beginning of the week was broken very quickly by Barnaby Joyce and Michael McCormack, both former Nationals leaders, who seem to be mounting a campaign against net zero, ostensibly, or the coalition's, the Nationals' commitment to net zero emissions by 2050. But really, it looks like a bit of a Trojan horse, a stalking horse to bring down David Littleproud. Just tell us a little bit about the mischief that those two are making, Michael McCormack and Barnaby Joyce.
Yeah, quite the way to start the first sitting day of Parliament by those two former Nationals leaders. McCormack and Joyce, obviously, both of them former Deputy Prime Ministers under the last coalition government. They've been pushed to the outer fringes of the National Party by the current leader, David Littleproud. There's so much personal history between this trio. When Barnaby Joyce was leader in the mid-part of last decade, he promoted David Littleproud, who was quite a new MP at the time, ahead of many others of his colleagues, into the cabinet. Joyce really rated Littleproud. They then had a falling out. McCormack took the leadership after Joyce had an issue with impregnating a staffer who is now his wife. And then Joyce subsequently toppled McCormack after a period of severe undermining. So you'd think that McCormack and Joyce wouldn't have much to do with each other, but over the last term of Parliament, there was quite a lot of dissatisfaction with David Littleproud's leadership, and Joyce and McCormack kind of came together over the last term, started to chat outside of Parliament. They would see each other around their electorates. I think they spent a bit of time with each other in the election campaign.
That's nice. So they had a sort of rapprochement.
They had a rapprochement.
That's nice.
They've become kind of friendly. They both don't have much love for the leader. Neither of them have the numbers in the party room. This is crucial, and they acknowledge that. Barnaby Joyce certainly doesn't. McCormack could be close to...
He's very, very, very sort of clearly... and obviously not ruled out, because he was asked that question quite directly, whether or not he wants to become the leader again. And he was it was pretty obvious. He didn't rule it out, and he didn't deny it at all. So we've got these two former enemies or former nemeses joining together to basically try to topple net zero. Where does this leave Susan Lee? Obviously, the coalition, the Liberals are now having a complete policy review of all the policies they took to the election, which includes the commitment to net zero by 2050. The Nationals are having a separate review of the net zero by 2050 commitment, but it's being done, crucially, by Matt Canavan, who's one of the sort of most pro-mining, most anti-climate change members in Parliament. Is it possible that they're going to end up like the Liberals and the Nationals will have a completely different stance, policy stance?
It's an open question, and it's a real prospect. The National Party process it's pretty clear where that's heading. Littleproud yesterday, in responding to this Joyce and McCormack push, which was revealed in The Australian, effectively said that the review that Matt Canavan and his colleague Ross Cadell are conducting will speak to some experts to justify that net zero is a huge burden on the economy and to regional communities. And he said net zero is an impossibility. It's burdening us. It's not good for the country. So it's clear where the National Party is going unless something radical changes there. It looks like they will drop their commitment to net zero, at least in its current form.
Yep.
The Liberal Party process is much less clear. There are very strong views on either side. You had Victorian Senator Jane Hume, a leading moderate. Potentially leading is a poor set of words because she's quite diminished after the election, but a strong voice on the moderate side say that net zero is critical to winning seats in the inner city. It's effectively a proxy for whether a party is seen as believing in climate change and viewing that as an issue of substance.
And wouldn't you also say a proxy, particularly in those inner metropolitan Teal seats, that the Liberals absolutely need to win back to have a path to government? It's sort of a proxy for whether or not your party is contemporary in keeping with sort of contemporary views on climate change, and also able to access the votes of younger people in particular, and I would say more broadly most women. I mean, these are issues. Climate change, action on climate change is particularly important to younger voters and particularly important to female voters. We know that. And these are the two cohorts that the Liberals have particularly struggled with.
Totally. And Susan Lee is is of a similar view, as are a lot of her key supporters, including Alex Hawke and Andrew Bragg and kind of people in the centre and to the moderate side of the Liberal Party. But then on the other side of the Liberal Party, you know, non-fringe politicians such as Andrew Hastie, for example, a future leadership contender, no doubt, has been telling colleagues in recent days that the party does need to dump net zero.
Right.
And, you know, he's not someone who, I don't think he's ever made utterances that indicate that he doesn't believe in climate change. He's just someone who holds the view that the world is shifting in a different direction. You see the Trump administration turn towards fossil fuels, really rocky trajectories to green energy in Europe. They see energy prices rising and they say, why should we be doing so much when developing countries like China are going to emit as much greenhouse gas between now and 2049, I think, as the US has done in its history. So there are strongly held views even in the mainstream of the Liberal Party. Yeah,
okay. So there is an argument, I suppose, or a view within the Liberal Party that you could use this as a product differentiation sort of issue and you could make it an economic argument, entirely an economic argument, which brings me, i.e. that the cost of transitioning to net zero and transitioning entirely to renewables is going to be borne too much by the Australian consumer and particularly people who can't afford it, like pensioners and so on. So let's talk about the Prime Minister, the Labor side now, because the government is actually going to have to make its own decision on net zero or our pathway to net zero pretty soon. In the next few weeks, the Climate Change Authority will deliver its decision on what the interim 2035 emissions reduction target should be. So basically where we need to be by 2035 if we're even going to get close to net zero by 2050. You reported this week that it's probably going to be in the order of 65 to 75% recommended cuts. How is Albanese going to handle this politically? And is he going to, it will cost money. It will cost the consumer. Energy prices will go up, at least in the short term. Is this a political risk for the government?
Well, this should be one of the key lines of attack from the coalition on Labor that puts the government in a really tricky position. Yeah. The transition to green energy across the world is really bumpy. Yeah. Australia is doing a pretty good job at getting towards its 2030 target, but it probably won't quite get there. 2035 target will be difficult again. There is difficulty in gaining social licence for big renewable projects in the country where solar and wind farms need to go. Yeah. The backlash was nowhere near as severe in some of these seats as the coalition kind of made out before the election. But there's no doubt that the shift towards a green future is not easy at all, leads to high prices in the kind of shorter medium term. That there's hope that will abate over time. But if the coalition had a clear policy of its own and wasn't so racked with disunity about whether there is man-made climate change, because there's quite a few people on the right of that party who just don't believe that and don't believe that anything much should be done about it. If it wasn't so racked by instability on its own side, it could mount a clear argument to say the government's moving too quickly towards a renewable future and that's costing Australians money. Now, the government has a decision to make on its 2035 target. Matt Keane, the former Liberal Treasurer of New South Wales, who was handpicked by Chris Bowen to run the Climate Change Authority, is quite close to delivering his advice to government, which will, I think, give a range of somewhere in the 60s, maybe up to 70% on that 25% emissions reduction target. The way this is being seen effectively is that a number in the 50s would be not ambitious enough and pretty much be business as usual in terms of the pathway. Somewhere in the 70s would be quite quick and would necessitate really quick shifts towards EVs, electrification of other areas, a lot of abatement in the agriculture sector, and quicker switching off of fossil fuel facilities like coal plants, which you see state governments across the country actually extending the life of coal plants because of how difficult this transition is. So there are a whole different bunch of trade-offs here, tricky politics, hard trade-offs. The consensus, and it's still an expectation at this point, not with much certainty, is that the government will land somewhere in the 60s. Yeah. But we'll probably see that over the next few months. And the politics of this internationally are important as well, because we're trying to win the next COP summit, the kind of the big international climate conference in Adelaide. And we have stiff competition from Turkey, which is yet to pull out, which is making our winning of that conference harder. We need to prove to the world that we're serious about climate change. And the Pacific, which we are trying to draw closer to us and away from China, which is shifting quickly towards a green economy, despite putting on a lot of coal plants and other things as well, also wants Australia to be ambitious.
Yeah, it's so tricky and it's fascinating, particularly if it's going to start, well, it will start costing the consumer, at least in the short term. Paul, just casting ahead to next week, are we going to get our lovely superannuation tax debate?
We're not. The government is being pretty coy about when and how it wants to approach that bit of legislation. The Greens say they want to make some minor tweaks to this law. They want to reduce the threshold from 3 million to 2 million and index it over time. Jim Chalmers, we don't believe, has had a substantive conversation with his Greens counterpart. So we don't know when that's going to come on. There's a chance it all gets tied into the whatever comes out of this economic roundtable that's been held in mid-August. So we're a bit none the wiser on all that.
Yeah, we're very excited about the economic roundtable. We love a roundtable on this podcast. It's all going to be
Canberra's going to be packed.
Oh,
you won't be able to book a flight to Canberra.
It's basically like Coachella for Canberra. It's going to be huge. It's going to be lit.
You're coming, right?
Maybe. I guess so. We'll definitely be talking about it on the podcast. Paul, we will see you next week, same time, same place-ish. Thanks very much for joining us.
Good to talk. Bye.